Welcome to She Been Ready, the podcast. She Been Ready is a conversation, a declaration, and a clarification that Black women have always led. On this podcast, I, Dr. Wendi Williams, educator, psychologist, leader, and auntie, will be joined by Black women who lead and those who have been led well by them. So, you don't have to get ready when you stay ready, and you can trust in the leadership of a Black woman because she been ready. Director of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, artist, visionary. I'm so very glad to have you on this podcast, She Been Ready, which, as we've shared, is a podcast around really uplifting and adding to the canon around leadership, the leadership praxis of Black women leaders. So I have had the pleasure of talking with a number of folks, and I'm so excited to be able to talk with you because there are ways in which I am watching and get excited about seeing the ways that Black women move in their leadership. And, you know, it's not happenstance, but it's also not elevated in such a way that we always are all viewing it and studying it in the same ways. I do because it's my interest, but I think that we have those historical examples, Fannie Lou Hamer, Zora Neale Hurston, and then we have people who are doing work right now. And I feel like it's this special moment and the opportunity to speak with people like you about your leadership practice. So,
sorry.
No, you're fine. So welcome to this space. And thank you for saying yes.
Thank you for having me. Can I call you Dr. Wendi in this space?
You could call me whatever you want. I'm just so happy you're here, but you can call me Dr.
Thank you. I really appreciate you inviting me to be a part of this platform that you have on thought leadership. And so I'm excited. I'm so excited to have this conversation.
Perfect. All right, well, let's dig in. So one of the first questions that I ask each person who comes on the show is, how did you know that you've been ready? So what was the work you were doing or engaging that made you realize that you needed to be at the helm? Was it even in the context of work? Was it on the playground or like playing with friends as a kid? You know, how old were you? What stage of career, if you were, professionally in that space? How did you know?
So I'll speak about my experience in sort of two frames. One is like what has been sown into me by the people who raised and influenced me. And the other is like this moment where I realized what I had been doing is what I'm doing now. So I come from a long line of organizers and people who move people into making real marked change. My grandmother was known for the changes that she made when she worked in Washington, D.C., organizing some of the young women who had come there as government girls, I think is what they called. There was a pool of secretaries that was sort of recruited from across the country. And, some of them worked in office buildings. I believe my grandmother worked both in an office building and for a church, and was a part of integrating one of the office buildings. And so, my mother and father were part of the San Francisco State Strike. My dad actually wrote the initiating charter for Black Studies, organized students into that strike, and then worked with several members of the BSU and the Chicano Students Union, the Asian Students Union, the Students for Democratic Society to stage the largest student strike in American history. And my mother was a student at that time as well, and was amongst the organized and the organizers. She later on, when she moved to Washington, D.C., built the Center for Black Education with her hand. She learned that she was a carpenter at that time. The Center for Black Education was a center that focused on health and well-being of people in Black communities. They served lunches, they did after-school programs. It was staffed by a number of people from the community in Southeast, and also staffed by some Howard students. And so again, I guess what I'm saying is like the history of how I got here is like, Barbara Christian, who was the first Black woman to be tenured at UC Berkeley is amongst the women I call my aunties, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, Daphne Muse, who used to be at Mills College, and you know, my cousin was provost at Spelman, and you know, so it's just like I just didn't have a choice, you know.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And so leadership sort of is a part of. My dad called me leadership as my nickname. Actually, he still calls me leadership, but as
That's
for, so if you can
funny.
imagine, I'm like a 3-year-old and he's like leadership, you know, instead of using my name. And so I think there are elements of leadership that was folded into me.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like I avoided leadership. And so I would tumble myself into a position and then wake up and be like, wait a second, I'm leading this thing. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I would wake up in the middle of leading. And I was a student in the graduate program at CalArts in the School of Theater when I realized what my leadership can actually do.
Mm-hmm.
Where I was actually really consciously making choices as a leader, to shift the way people experienced their artistic practice. And I was in a rehearsal process I directed August Wilson's Fences when I was in graduate school,
Mm-hmm.
and not a conventional, a very experimental version of that play.
Mm-hmm.
And but using it as a platform to sort of understand what process was as a director. My
Mm-hmm.
artistic practice was actually what I was focused on. But I learned in the process that here's an opportunity as
Mm-hmm.
a leader to help the other, my collaborators, the actors and the designers, recognize that there might be a way of doing this work that is empowering and engaging and evolutionary, a way that sort of allows us to center fulfillment in the work that we do. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember actively making decisions as a director, as the
Mm-hmm.
leader of that project,
Mm-hmm.
actively making a decision, or decisions around making sure that people could take some of what they were experiencing in this process with them to their next process, as a way of sort of infiltrating other processes with
Mm-hmm.
this idea that you can design a process that activates the best in people, which I believe is what leadership is. I believe that leadership is this idea of being nimble enough in guiding, being nimble enough in collaboration, and nimble enough in what you're learning along the way, and being guided. All of
Mm-hmm.
those things have to come together in order to ensure that leadership is actually evolutionary.
So I have to unpack what you just put in front of me. I do. There's so many elements. And so I'm just going to take piece by piece, if that feels okay. You know, one of the things that strikes me is just this legacy that you were born into. You know, I'm an educator. And so I think about the early childhood implications of being called leadership at 3 years old by your
Yes.
father, you know? Um, and also having mother and grandmother and aunties strategically placed, it seems, in ways, but also that they were actively inside of a purposeful movement in this country. They were not unclear. And so I'm wondering about how their trajectory and you being raised within that shaped how you would define or describe your specific leadership philosophy. You started it already with naming what you say leadership is, you know, supporting others, but also that infiltration piece is something else that you've mentioned. Maybe let's just back up and say, what is Nataki Garrett's leadership philosophy?
Mm. I imagine myself to be a really conscious leader, in that I don't, and then and I'll say, I won't say that in the negative, in the affirmative. I'm a
Mhm.
conscious leader, and that I'm always looking for opportunities to grow and evolve in the way that we think, in the way
Mhm.
that we do things, in the way that we engage our systems,
Mhm.
because systems are people, and people's practices are either oppressive, or they are evolving, helping people evolve into liberating practices.
Mhm.
And so, at the center of my leadership is this design towards liberation. And I also,
Mhm.
because I do deeply believe that that organizational liberation is the space in which you come to the space of the organization so that you can continue to liberate others through your ideas, through
Mhm.
your mastery and your expertise. And so
Mhm.
the point of leadership is to give people either the platform or the amplifier or a
Mhm.
way to engage what their centered central expertise is, so that they can continue to evolve ideas, to continue to evolve practices, to
Mhm.
continue to evolve organizational practices, so that they continue to liberate people.
Mhm. Mhm.
Liberation is not necessarily a freedom from bondage, if you will. I
Mhm.
believe that liberation is also a practice in centering spirit, in
Mhm.
and making sure that we that the way in which we are being used in the world, which I believe is spirit based, is
Mhm.
actually as free and as open as possible.
Mhm.
Tom Waits talks about how genius descends on us, right,
Mm.
in these inopportune moments. And
Mm.
you need to be free enough to recognize it as genius, and also humble enough to know that it's fleeting. It's
Mm.
coming to you for this moment, in this moment. For
Seize
you,
it.
it's exactly, you are
Mhm.
the vessel through which something is coming into the
Mhm.
world. And so leadership is connected to giving people the space, the time, the resource, the opportunity, the amplification to be able to meet that, and
Mhm.
be able to meet it unfettered, with an open channel, so that the things that are born through them into the world actually get to us.
Mm.
Um, I don't believe that everything good comes to us in that way. Some things come to us in terrible ways.
Yeah.
But if I can do my part to be a part of the good, I will do everything in my power to do that. But that's what I think is at the center of leadership,
Mhm.
is how do you create as unfiltered a space so that people can have their ideas born into the world.
Mm. Mm.
Their spirit has to be open and uncentered. I mean, sorry, untethered
Mm.
and centered.
Mhm.
And there has to be intention in your leadership to help people get there.
Mm. A lot of what you've just said is around cultivating the conditions for others.
Yes.
So I hear that, I hear that. I believe that strongly too. And I appreciate the vantage point that you're bringing in this space to talk about it in that way. And, I know that I came to know of you and to meet you as a result of an articulation of your leadership, trying to con- where you were creating the conditions for others, you were cultivating the conditions for others. So you convened a group of Black women leaders who were identified as the first in their respective fields, various fields, many from the arts, but many from tech and other areas. It was such a wonderful gathering. So I want to say thank you again. I was so grateful to be included. I love that kind of space. It met me in a particular moment in my life when I was open and in a transition. So it like, those moments when you're just plugged into at the right time and you're like, and I can be available for it. This is great, like
Yeah.
fully open to it. So I thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
And
Thanks for being a part of
oh
it.
my God, it was so wonderful. And while being there, I started paying attention to you. So I started paying attention to you before I got there, because that's how I behave. I'm like, oh, well, what's going on over there? And then as we were there, I was like, well, what's going on here? Tell me about creating for others what also you need, right? Because when you're cultivating the condition for others, you're also, and at least I took note of you, that you were cultivating those conditions for yourself as well. And for me, this is a particular form of Black women's leadership practices. We actually have to do that because the conditions aren't actually there, and we're the only ones who know how to do it.
Yes.
Why is it important to do it? And in what ways, if at all, has being a Black woman informed why you did that for us and for you?
Yeah. So I believe that the calling of the ancestors is that you are responsible for past, present, and future. If
Mhm.
you're not, and if you're not focused on future, your present will inform how you impact the future. And
Mhm.
if you're not focused on what brought you here, your present will inform how you utilize your access to the past to help support the future. I don't know why I've had this balance in that. Maybe it's
Mm.
because of the people who sewed into me.
Mm-hmm.
But my understanding is that my situation of leadership comes with responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And so otherwise I wouldn't have it. It's like as if my grandmother were here, she would say, I always knew that was going to happen for you. Like I always knew this was coming, or, I told you that this is how it was going to be.
You been ready, she would have said, right?
Exactly. She would have said, you've been ready. Right. But with that comes this like other proviso.
Yeah.
If you're going to have that, now you don't have to access it. It's there for you because I knew it was yours.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going to have that, it comes with the responsibility. And so I feel like I was, that responsibility was like, when you go out in the world, you represent me,
mm-hmm.
And all Black people under the sun, it comes in those directives that you receive from your mothers and your grandmothers who are like, remember the responsibility that comes with you being yourself in the world.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have autonomy. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important, but I also just think I could give it to them. But I think it's also like beyond them, you have to develop your own ideas about who you are in the world and the impact that you have. Mm-hmm. And I believe that when I have only focused on my present and my own thing for myself in terms of leadership, I have always failed. Now that failure has led to lessons and evolution on its own, right? But it has been like, I can name some pretty abysmal experiences I've had simply because I was just looking at my own navel, So I find myself in a safer place in my work when I am looking both forward, backwards, and inside of me. Right? When I'm looking in all three spaces at once and not balance. It's not like everybody gets a percentage. But when I'm clear that the things I'm sowing now will help support the future, but will also help support my present. I've been asking for that for a couple of years, the convening of Black women. And let me just turn that off so that it doesn't make any more noise. By the time it came, I was in a place where I desperately needed you all to be here with me. And so I also am grateful because I cultivated something that was coming into the future that I didn't know was actually going to be possible. And when it came at a future that allowed for my present to be sustained. So, I guess sometimes you call something into the future that you will meet. It will come and meet you too at the right time. And so that was really an important convening for me as well. And I do feel like I'm always fulfilled when people around me are fulfilled. And so, I like to work as a director. My artistic practice is as a theater director and a film director. And I like to work when people are like inspired.
Yeah.
I feel like my best work is when the actors are like in their juices and the designers are like doing things that they couldn't imagine possible without working with each other, where we have all come together in this room to create something that we can only create through the genius of our presence with each other, not separately, but only together. I thrive in collaborative spaces. And so I feel like I'm always sewing into everyone else as a way of sewing into myself. I try to do both at the same time because I need it myself.
That's a bit of double Dutch. One of the things that I think is, we talked about the navel gazing and how it has not led to good outcomes, but also obviously lessons that can have good outcomes later or can contribute to that. But I was just thinking about how when we are in our most difficult times, when we are having difficulty, it's very hard not to navel gaze. So I'm just kind of thinking about and wondering if you have any practice that you engage that could be helpful for our listeners to hear and to think about how you can, or what you do when in that space of feeling maybe constriction or limited opportunity, not fall into the practice or the habit of becoming preoccupied with yourself and what is so hard for you, but rather to be expansive and to look outside of yourself, see others, see connection, see that as a possibility.
I think that when you are compelled to look at your own navel, you have to trust that as a moment of introspection,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to give in to that. So what's interesting about when the convening, at the beginning of the convening, there was a question that was asked about, like, what do you need to be whole here?
Mm-hmm.
And you had to say that to somebody at the table. And I
Mm-hmm.
said something like, I just need to be able to, like, tell the truth about where I am today.
Mm-hmm.
Because I am in spaces where I don't get to do that very often. And I need this to be a space where that's possible.
Okay.
And I was definitely in a navel. That first day I was like, oh, look at my navel. Oh, my navel, my navel, my navel, my navel. You know? and I'm grateful, because what was cultivated for that moment was a space in which I can be like, y'all okay with that? And everybody
Yeah.
was like, yeah, we got
Mm-hmm.
you.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so sometimes the introspective work is a part of what you give to other people when you
Mm.
have to learn how to lean on each other. And I have to say that I don't know very many sisters who are well practiced
Mm-hmm.
at leaning on other people. Usually
Okay
we are
now.
brought to our knees
Mm-hmm.
and then we lean, and we're like, oh, because I'm so far forward,
I
I
am
have
falling
to lean.
over that somebody has to come pick
Exactly.
me up. I just happen to be leaning on them now because they have picked me up.
Exactly.
Oh,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah. Oh,
So I
goodness.
think that's a part of it too, is that sometimes you, like, the words that came out of my mouth in that moment where I was
Mm-hmm.
asked to answer the question about what I needed, I couldn't lie about. I couldn't be like,
Mm.
I'm fine, whatever. I had to say, no, I'm not here right now in the way that
Yeah,
I want it to be. And I need y'all to be okay with that. And
mm,
everybody was.
they
And I
were.
got through that first day. And by the second day, I was like, here she is. I remember her. Thank
Mm,
you for coming, Nataki. This version of yourself
mm,
that actually wanted to enjoy these moments, as opposed to be so, I don't know, raw. I was so raw on that first day.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
also when things are manifested that you create, sometimes I get scared when I'm like, oh, I
Yeah.
made this.
Uh-huh.
I don't know what to do now.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. They say uh that can be the scariest thing. You really
Yeah.
did call all those people there. I was really struck by it. Um, and especially considering the space to which you were calling us to, and what I felt in those spaces, but I can only imagine is felt in those spaces by you and others like you. So it really is a hope and a prayer and a leap of faith and a call. And I felt really proud to be one of the women who answered.
Yeah.
Yeah, it gave us an
I was
opportunity to be
grateful.
that for each other, you know?
Yeah.
Anywho.
I was humbled by the fact that so many came,
Mhm.
and sisters were saying things like, I didn't, they were like, I read about Southern Oregon and I still got on the plane, and I was like, yeah, you did, you here too. And I can see
Yeah,
you right
yeah,
now.
yeah,
Thank you for
yeah.
getting on that plane,
It's
because I
not a
needed you
Zoom
here.
call, you know?
No, you had to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's real. So one of the pieces of being there is that you arranged for us to see this amazing play, Confederates. And I want for you to share a little bit about that play with us. And I'll say from the outstart, uh, what happened for me in watching that play. Um, I'm an academic. That play is situated in academia. I thought, oh God. But I'm also a psychologist and an educator who writes about Black women at work and our leadership and development experiences and our work and professional experiences and the ways in which we have to, or in the ways in which we feel called to be in those spaces that are protective, that sometimes can be toxic and damaging, and just kind of being in, exploring that. So I believe that the arts and academic scholarship have an important and often missed opportunity to advance a larger vision for our society, and I would say for our liberation, particularly as Black folks. Um, I wish I saw it more, but I saw it in that space, and primarily because that play is the subject of my intellectual academic work, and I was like, this is beautiful, like it was. I think the heavens opened and I heard some cherubs singing. Tell us about Confederates. Tell us about, you know, why at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival is it, you know, is it placed there? What makes that a useful space for it to be happening? And what relationships do you see between the scholarly intellectual space and this artistic space? How can they become and get in closer conversation with one another, in your view?
So Confederates is a play that was written by Dominique Morceau.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a commission under a commissioning program that OSF, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, used to have called American Revolutions. And that was under the leadership of my predecessor, Bill Rausch. So he came up with this idea of an American story cycle in which writers would be asked to respond to certain reflective moments in American history. And the writers were allowed to write whatever they wanted. And so Dominique Morceau was approached with the article by Ta-Nehisi Coates, in which he engaged the question about why Black people don't engage academically or anecdotally in conversations around the Civil War. Mm-hmm. It's like slavery and freedom, and then the Civil War is some sort of this other space. And so she wrote this play in which she was, you know, engaging with these two ideas based on this article. And so Dominique Morceau doesn't generally write plays about the enslavement of people. And she doesn't actually tend to write plays in which Black women in particular are the subject of enslavement. But there's something about this play, and this is, you know, she can speak for her own self about what inspired it, but there's something about this play that actually allowed for the two reflective sides of the play to speak to this sort of total experience of Black womanhood in these United States. And so I was engaged with this play in 2019. We had slated to produce it in 2020, and of course the pandemic upended all of that. And it was one that I sought to bring back, and when we were finally able to bring our plays back to the stage. In that time, Dominique did some rewrites of it and had let me know that she felt like it was actually in some ways a satire, you know, or on the comic scale. And I remember saying to her in a conversation, I don't think I am the right director for this as a satire. I think that there's humor in here, but I think that the experiences that reflected on the stage for both women, both of these Black women who are central characters in this story that is looking at Black womanhood in circumstances 150 years apart. A woman who's enslaved, who becomes a spy for the Union Army, a woman who is working in the academy and is a tenured professor at a well-known, impactful, you know, high-powered Ivy League school, and is sort of embedded in the system. And both of them are, you know, both reflections are looking at Black women in these systems that are really systems of white supremacy. And so I was like, I don't know if I have access to the satire version of this play. Maybe we should find another director for it. I'm happy to start looking right away. And Dom said, no, actually, I need you to do this one. This is for you. And so I was like, okay, because
time.
Yeah.
Why do you think she pressed you?
I didn't ask.
You didn't ask. Okay.
Because I have this thing about trusting artists. And if I say to you where my limits are and you say back to me, but it's still you, I'm going to trust that this is right.
Okay.
And so I didn't engage further, actually.
Okay.
And I reluctantly continued to move towards directing it, even though every time I read that play, I was like, because I was in academia too at Cal Arts. And every time I read the play, I was like, it's like a horror story.
You know, the fact the horror genre with racism is an interesting thing. And then I thought, it's on the stage. And you said it's 150 years apart, but it's back to back in the way that it was constructed on the stage too.
Yeah. And the question of the play is it still back to back? You know, are these, you know, there's a question that I keep holding that I've asked the actors to hold on to in their work, because when I direct a play, I give the actors opportunities to continue to evolve in their storytelling, as they, you know, because it takes a long time for an actor to really deeply get to know a character. And if you lock them out of process, when you leave, what you come back is the museum version of what you directed. And I don't want to see that. So I like when an actor keeps going back to the well, you know, possibilities, when they're like, what if this is like this instead of like that, you know? And one of the questions I kept asking is Sarah, the enslaved character, more free at the end of the play than Sandra, the woman in academia? You know, what is this point of liberation? And what is this point of freedom? You know, and that actually, for me, the question then becomes, are they more free at the beginning of the play in the adverse? You know, so what is this point of freedom? Is it mental? Is it how you see freedom? You know, in its connection to academia. So because a predominant part of my practice was connected to working in academia.
Okay, I didn't realize.
I don't have a line drawn between the two. So this play that is about being in academia was just more reflective of experiences that I've had than it was like there's a difference, right? But I do believe that a literary approach to this play would actually come to the same series of questions. You know, if I were to just sort of do an analysis of this text in an academic way, I would still be hit with the same questions as I am watching people embody these characters, which is the framing is, what is the difference between these two experiences, and where are the similarities? Because the one thing that's missing in both worlds is the most dominant thing, the force of the room, which is white supremacy, which is everywhere else. Right? It is the air, it is the water, it is the oxygen, it is the floor and the ceiling and the wall.
That is so interesting, Nataki.
The indictment is actually, how do you live through this when you know there's no space in which it doesn't exist?
It's interesting because of the way I'm probably going to geek out a little bit, so just give me this for a second. The way that the stage was constructed, there were no walls. There was no containment for the experience. There is no walking away from the influence and the force of white supremacy on either of those systems. Was that purposeful?
Yes, that was purposeful.
I just got that right now. You feel that kind of everywhere and everything feeling, but I didn't get it until right now.
And I think that that's true no matter what your audience is too. I think that, you know, when we move it to St. Louis, and the hope is that we'll have a greater presence of people of color in those spaces. And there is something about the space still having to yield to the fact that the institution itself is this institution that reflects white supremacy.
Absolutely.
You know, and theater was created in these spaces, and that it's okay to say it out loud that, you know, theater is the modern theater is a result of the sort of pressure that is created through oppressive systems, which those oppressive systems are oppressive because of white supremacy.
You know, it's interesting. You talked about experimental elements. So taking, experimenting with form and taking a story traditionally known and doing things with it. Y'all are doing that at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. But what I want to say is, it's not just putting Black characters in Romeo and Juliet. It's more than that. It's hard to name sometimes, but I can feel the intentionality, and there's a little bit of, or maybe a lot of intellectualism that I think has to be involved in order to play with things in this way. I don't know if it's going behind the curtain and seeing the wizard, but I'd love to hear a little bit about like what you think about that. What is it that you're doing? How is it that What is that approach? And how do you see that as a form of your leadership in that space?
Well, I think that theater is a sort of study of humanity, so I
Mm.
think the practice comes from the same place, right?
Mhm.
It just relies a little bit more on intrinsic and anecdotal connections to what's real
Mhm.
in the world, as opposed to clarifying by pulling opinions together, or seeking some sort of historical context for it, or the other ways in which the academy tends to sort of ask us to engage.
Mhm.
What the theater does is it says, here we're gonna embody this moment with the spirit of humanity. Like, we're
Mhm.
gonna ask another human to don a character and live in their circumstance fully. And we're just gonna give that an opportunity, give ourselves an opportunity to understand something about our own humanity by witnessing humanity.
Mhm.
That's what the theater does. And so I don't think that there's a difference, right? I think
Mhm.
that um, uh, uh, the what moves you in your is not just the fact that you see something reflected that you recognize, right?
Mhm.
What moves you is also your understanding. So it's the intrinsic and the intellectual meeting together. When
Mhm.
I was
Mhm.
teaching at Cal Arts, we talked a lot about the intellect of the body,
Mm.
that the brain is not the only space that holds intellect, that the
Okay.
body is always has been able to reflect what the human desired since
Mhm.
before words came through the
Mhm.
human's mouth. Like, I watch my daughter, who's 2, who's coming to words, and people are like, oh, well, now she'll be better at communicating. And I was like, I actually don't know if that's
Mhm.
true.
Mhm.
I think she's been communicating.
Yes,
And it
she
was my job to watch her tell the story with her toes and be
Mhm.
able to
Mhm.
say, oh, these toes are looking for something
Mhm.
specific,
Mhm.
right? That
Mhm.
we sometimes we deny that. And I think the what theater does is offer this sort of intersection between what the brain does to tell you things and what the heart does to tell you things, and how they work together
Mm.
to make sure that you are impacted enough so that you walk away with a greater understanding of the world that is beyond, again, what you think, you don't really
That.
know until you can actually reflect on it. You don't really know it until you can go, oh, right, right, you know.
Well, and that, so there it's in that you don't really know what you think you know. And the playing with figure and form, the expected with the unexpected, the twist of the turn here or there on the stage,
Yeah,
puts in front of audience members like myself, perhaps even the actors and the creators in that space as well, alternative realities.
yes,
Yeah. And so,
it's deeper.
it's deeper. And I'm sort of thinking of, that sort of Afrofuturist or speculative fiction space. Then it puts in front of us other possibilities for freedom and for liberation as well.
Yeah, because all it's doing, what Dominique Morceau wrote is a
Mm-hmm.
series of questions about liberation,
Mm-hmm.
you know? In fact, we had a meeting with her just before we opened, and
Mm-hmm.
one of the actors asked her, like, what is liberation here?
Mm-hmm.
And she said, sometimes liberation is just knowing that other people can see what you see,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And because she said sometimes it is something, as opposed to liberation is, and there's not a list.
Mm-hmm.
What I also took from it was she still has questions about liberation, and the play was a way of expressing those questions.
Mm-hmm.
Is this freedom? Are we
Mm-hmm.
free in this? Does this offer freedom? At this moment, does she liberate the boy when he says those nasty things to her? Is she liberated in her ability to sort of move through the manipulations of the white woman? Like,
Mm-hmm.
is she liberated in this act of care when she finally hears the other sister out? Like, what is liberation in these moments?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think when you're in a non-free space,
Mm-hmm.
liberation becomes something. It becomes a series of things, not just the one thing.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's making me think back to what we were just saying about navel gazing. Um,
Yeah.
and liberation is maybe the small act that helps you to look away from your navel after a while. Or perhaps liberation is looking more deeply at what is the need, what is the concern, so we can respond to it.
Yeah,
Micro acts, not necessarily that. I think that when we think of, I'll speak for myself, when I think of like this idea of liberation and freedom, these are very large words, and I'm looking for us to run off of a plantation and have freedom songs like all around us. And
yes,
perhaps it's, perhaps there are other micro spaces in time and place where we make decisions before we make any move, or we have a
exactly.
different orientation and shift in understanding before anybody even knows what we are planning. And just appreciating that our ancestors had to have that level of forethought, planning, and engagement with themselves first, embodying it before it could ever become an outward expression of all the things that we've seen.
Yeah, like the moment at the end of the play where the sister says, you know, what her body is not used for anymore. And that declaration of independence,
Mm-hmm.
you know, being able to say, even if you do use my body for those things, it's not, my body is not used for those things. You know, there are these little nuggets within the play, within the writing that, like, you know, there's a character who talks about having to engage in sex acts, and she's very clear about how she activates her liberation within these moments where she doesn't actually have the freedom and the autonomy to say or do what it is she gonna say or gonna do on her own. So she has to activate in her mind a moment of liberation. And maybe sometimes liberation is what you do to yourself to survive a moment in which you have no power. You know what I mean? And that's why it's like liberation becomes a series of, like you said, micro acts, as opposed to some big moment of like, I think white supremacy says it has to be a big moment. Martin Luther King on the steps of the Jefferson Memorial is a liberatory moment, right? The Civil Rights Act passing is a liberatory moment. The March to Selma becomes a liberatory moment without a real understanding about the moments that led to that, the consequence of those moments, and what happened to the people as a result of those moments. That people had to be refreed and refreed and refreed after each of those.
Freed. Oh goodness.
You know,
I was
and
thinking
so,
about the chicken that got fried to put into the car to get to the March on Washington. Was a
exactly.
liberatory moment.
Exactly.
All of
Or
it.
Miss Luzo, who was killed on the way back to go pick people up, to take them back from the moment of liberation.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
along with the young Black man that was with her. You know, you have to kind of. My grandmother used to say, when I'd ask big questions, she used to say, "The only thing I can promise you, sweetheart, is that in 100 years there'll be all new people." Right. And so
that's good.
You know, because she was like, I don't know the answer, you know.
She's like, listen.
But other people will be pondering these things. Of course, you know, when you're like 9, you're like,
Grandma, I want the answer. Well, you know what's interesting too, and I love that you framed it in the perspective of white supremacy tells you that it needs to be X, Y, or Z, because it also then is saying to me, to you, to my nieces, to your baby girl, to whomever all over the world, big and small ways, men, women, children, all of it, that unless it's that big thing, it's nothing. And so therefore it's not liberation and you're not free. So people can't see the steps that they're making and the bricks that they're laying for more liberatory space and future.
Like what's happening in Iran, you know, these women are like, and that's still going on, even if the news doesn't report it.
That's right.
You know, who's being jailed in Russia for their dissonance against the state, you know. I think we forget how many tiny steps are taken in order for us to have 1 ounce of liberation, right? Because the dominant power structure is not all that interested in releasing, right? And it shows up. You know, it's like that, the Matrix, when that character can show up in anybody's body, it shows up in anybody's body. Your ally all of a sudden is looking back at you and saying things like, well, here's a moment where I actually don't want you to have liberation.
Exactly.
So I have an opinion about why you might liberate yourself in this moment.
Oh, gosh.
You know? You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean.
You have to be, so you actually have to take the tiny steps. And I think that's why the navel gazing moment or the self-care moment is so important, because by the time a sister comes to the space where she can say, I need this moment to look at myself, because we are so often placed in these activated in these moments of extraction, you know, and we stay prepared for that,
Yeah.
right? That when you're finally like, listen, I have nothing today, and if I'm gonna have anything tomorrow, I need this moment right now for me, and I need you to know that I'm leaned over on my knees. Could you just help hold my hand for a minute? By that time, you have to trust that if that sister's saying that, she
She
really
needs
does
it.
need to look at her. She needs to be right in her belly and not out at the world, because once she can have that moment, there might be, that is a moment of liberation when you
Yes,
can
it
look
is.
in at your navel and be like, this is my navel, and I am in this moment by
Uh-huh.
myself, and I need this moment so that I can come back out into the world.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily believe that our existence being points of extraction on this, in this culture, this country, I don't believe that that's necessarily entirely the worst thing. I think that what is the worst thing about it is that some people perceive that that is the only thing that we're useful for.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there is something that we offer to the world.
Mm-hmm.
We are vessels in a way that nobody else can be. That space cannot be shared. So I would never give that up. What I don't want to be is only a point of extraction. I need some things to be sown and put into me. I need to be able to extract and move things through me to give to somebody else, you know, to take for myself, even just to hold them and consume them. And I think that that's where the space is uneven. We've been designated. And that's what the play is talking about. Those sisters are designated as points of extraction, you know.
For sure. And the ways that they absorb that and have to also points of liberation are to say whether or not that continues to be true for them.
Yes.
Listen, I could talk to you forever. So there are two more questions that I have for you that are Nataki, this is such a gift. But one of the questions that we ask every guest that comes on is, thinking about the young women, or thinking about folks who are looking for guidance, who are looking for validation in the ways in which they show up and that they lead. Young girls, folks, young women early in their career, folks who are supporting them, that kind of thing. If you were to be speaking into their lives or trying to impart and shape the experience, cultivate conditions for them with whomever, what are some advice or words of wisdom you would impart?
I think the most important thing is to take it one step at a time, and to be present in the moments that you're in, to know that each moment that you're experiencing will accumulate enough resource for you that you can draw from when you need it.
Yeah.
That sometimes you're placed into situations where you don't know you have the skill set, and you find the skill set in that space, and you just have to know that everything that happened up until that moment prepared you for that moment, and something within that moment is also preparing you. And then the last thing I'll say is that this is my attachment to conscious leadership.
Okay.
If you find yourself looking for blame, and you find yourself pointing at the mistake, you also do not have the ability to look at the evolution and the lesson in those moments. And as soon as you let go of blame and mistake, the lesson comes forward. And that is specifically when you are blaming yourself. It doesn't mean that you can't learn from the things that you do. But mistakes are only lessons. They're opportunities for you to grow, unless you wallow in them. And when people make mistakes around you, those are also lessons for both you and them. I think that's where my head is right. My heart is right now.
Okay.
This is the last thing I'll say to sisters.
Okay.
If you feel like you're experiencing it, you are experiencing it. Do not allow yourself to gaslight yourself.
Ashe. It's happening because you said it's happening, because you feel that, and that's what's real. Oh, absolutely. Okay, so the last question I have for you, and is, what are you up to? What's your work? What is your vision? What are you doing right now? What are you manifesting that you feel comfortable sharing, if if anything, that you want to call the audience's attention to.
So I'm at OSF, and so we're gearing towards our next season, which will be our 88th season.
Oh.
And it's a miracle that we got through the 87th season, because it's getting through a pandemic is really difficult. I am focused on the work that I did this year, which I actually think was really successful, centering the artists, centering the work that they do, being intentional about the artists that come to OSF, because I believe that artists are thought leaders and change makers who transform lives.
Yes.
And so that is what I'm going to continue to do. Artistically, I'm working on a Romeo and Juliet that will be produced next year, in which I'm looking at Western expansion, the manifest destiny, a myth, and the current homeless crisis as the point of intersection, looking at the sort of disparagement between these two families and what happens with their children. Come on.
I'm coming up. I have been thinking about season tickets. I love what I see coming out of there. Okay, please finish.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, but
so
yes,
I'm doing
that
that, and gearing up towards that, all the work that we're doing for next year.
Okay.
And I'm getting on the road. We're in a desperate need to raise money and awareness, not just for OSF, but for the industry, theater industry, and to try to remind people that if you want the theater to exist in 25 years, you have to attend now. And so I'm getting on the road to sort of move people towards ways in which they can support organizations that may not have necessarily supported them in the past, but how they can be a part of making sure that there is a future, utilizing some of the things that I learned about in history, that the WPA projects, the federal theater projects, used in some part the backs of Black and Brown people to make sure that they were really instituted, because the force and the focus of the federal theater project was to be embedded in communities, to make change within communities. And so we just have to remember that communities are our number one asset and resource as we're trying to make sure that our industry comes back. And those communities may or may not include a white dominant audience set that has been focused on centering themselves. It may include those same white people who have been a part of collective consciousness and have been embedded in ways of making sure that everybody had access. And it'll include everybody else, all the people under the sun.
Thank you. I thank you so much. I really appreciate the work that you do, the sacrifices you make to do the work that you do, and how much we all can learn from it. I think that there's so much there as a place for our own intellectual development. And I would say also our spiritual development too.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for having me, Dr.
Oh my
Wendi.
gosh,
really
this has been such a joy.